Hello, my dear friends. I'm your host, Samantha, and welcome to the new Sedge Circle podcast. How are you today? I hope you're well. For those of you who are returning listeners of the Mooncast, you will have noticed I've made a few changes. I feel that these changes better reflect who I am and the message that I'm trying to bring to the community. But for the most part, these changes are artistic, and I will be covering much of the same material that I have in the past and so much more. So thank you so much for coming along with me. Now, on to today's topic. Never could I have imagined I would have access to so many well-made and incredible blank spellbooks in my life. And let's not forget the copious amount of spells the internet has brought us, which at times can feel overwhelming. Which brings me to today's topic. How many spells, let alone books, do you need? When I began my magical journey long ago, my spellbook was a composition notebook I had wrapped in blue velvet fabric. Most of what I put in that book was healing recipes, essential oil blends, teas, baths, and so on. Most, if not all, the resources I had at the time were the local library, which, let's face it, didn't have an overabundance of magical text. And at some point, we had a Barnes & Noble. Imagine my surprise to learn you could sit around in Barnes & Noble and read the books with no pressure to buy them. This was excellent news for me because, well, I had no money. Occasionally, I would get lucky and a local shopkeep might share their knowledge with me, but that was few and far between. Never mind, I began my path well before I could legally drive, and getting to these places often required careful planning. Over many years, I scribbled down tidbit after tidbit of information in that little velvet book, and I used the recipes I had gathered often. It wasn't until the invention, or at least my accessibility of, the internet, that my spellbook really began to grow. I scoured page after page of the internet, writing down everything I came across. Eventually, I found I had no idea what was actually in my spellbook, and didn't know where to look for what. I have about 4 fully completed spellbooks in my possession, and truthfully, I barely use any of them. While they're nice to have so I can look back on my own magical journey, I've found I just don't need that many spells. Which brings us to the question at hand. How many spells do you really need in your spellbook? And just how many spellbooks do you need? The answer to that question is dependent upon a few things. Firstly, what do you intend to put in your spellbook? Will it be strictly spells, rituals, and ceremonies? Or are you like me and put not only spells but healing recipes in as well? Much of my spellbook is tables and general information. Basically, it's anything I would have found myself looking up over and over again. I have a botanical section, a section on the runes and their meanings, as well as a section on stones and minerals. Beyond that, I have anything I consider magical. I have my mead recipe, as well as a few different stew recipes. Another thing that dictates how many spells, and books for that matter, is if you follow or at least research more than one specific path. Perhaps you will have a book dedicated to druidism and another for green witchery. If you're a kitchen witch, you might have a magical cookbook that holds all your favorite recipes. Now, you could easily put all of this into one book, but it is also nice to have a separate book for each, especially if you have been researching them for a long time. You could also have smaller spell books that contain information about each element, or one that holds all your knowledge of crystals. It really depends on how much time you want to dedicate to transcribing all of this information, as well as keeping these books up. But what about actual spells? As far as those are concerned, I've taken to the practice of having spells for specific situations in life. Not only in my life, but situations others might come across should they ask for help. For this, I consider the less is more approach. I have a spell for abundance, love, protection, banishing, cleansing, blessing, and so on. If you look at any spell books on the market, you'll usually find there are spells listed for all of these situations, and that is because they are universal and things we all experience from time to time. But it has been my experience that you don't need that many spells. In this case, I choose quality over quantity. One benefit of only having 1 or 2 spells for each situation is you become familiar with them. By becoming familiar with them, you're better able to invest yourself in the actual act of magic, as opposed to looking back to your book every few seconds to make sure you're doing it right. Over time, you'll most likely even have them memorized. But doesn't this negate the need for the spell book in the first place? Hardly. It is always good, no matter how well you have a spell memorized, to give yourself a little refresher. I can say after so many years of learning and collecting spells that sometimes they blend together. As far as the number of spell books you have is concerned, this is completely up to you. Instead of having everything in one place, you might have a book dedicated to healing and one dedicated to a specific tradition or path. For example, I have one spell book that holds all the general knowledge I've picked up over the years, and another that holds all things related to what could be considered Norse shamanism and Sedge. And this, my friends, is how you end up with a magical library. Witches and wizards are depicted in art as being surrounded by tomes and scrolls, usually messily strewn about. And why? Because this is a reality of being a magical person. At times, the amount of loose papers and scribbles I have in my library feels anxiety-inducing. And that is the time I take a bit of time to clean up and transcribe some of those loose papers into one of my books. And because of this, I feel like I also have a relationship with my library. It becomes a living thing that needs maintenance and care. This is one thing I do to help me keep grounded in my spiritual path that doesn't involve spell casting or ritual. The spells in your book should be like your favorite cooking recipes, things you make over and over again because you enjoy them that much. These are spells you have a proverbial relationship with, like an old friend. And that's not to say you can't add more later, though. In fact, this is almost inevitable as you learn and grow. And you may find over time, as I have, the spells in your current book no longer resonate with the magic you practice. This is the point where I usually find a new empty spell book and start the process all over again. One thing I will say is that when you have been studying magic as long as I have, you tend to accumulate a lot of information. And while it would be nice to have it all in one place, for me, it's just not practical anymore. That is, unless I wanted to invest in a very big book. But who wants to lug around a gigantic tome with them? Especially if you are venturing out in nature to conduct your magical workings. For me, I find it much more convenient to have different volumes for different things. So, my friends, I suppose that's all I have to say about that today. If you like this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, as well as feel free to share this with your friends. One small announcement is that the podcast is now available on Amazon Music, which is pretty exciting. So again, I suppose that's all I have to say. And until we meet again,